So this movie is about protecting the workbook and the worksheet. There are a lot of options when it comes to protecting your workbook. We're going to begin by looking at the protection levels for the workbook itself, and then the protection levels for the cells. And finally, you can actually establish protection levels for ranges where you identify certain groups and certain individuals that can access ranges in your worksheets. So as I said, there's a lot of functionality when it comes to protecting your workbook and your worksheets. And in fact, we've already covered some of the functionality in another movie, so we're not going to recover that same material here. But I set up a schedule to sort of organize some of the functionality. Beginning with column B, there's basically 5 different interactions you can have with your workbook when you're setting these protection options. And the options are associated with basically 3 different levels. It's either the workbook level, or the cell level, or ranges. And when you're setting these protections, you either have the option to set up a password for that specific protection, or you don't. And next, I showed where to find the functionality. And finally, in column F, the protections we're engaging and activating are listed there. So the Save As dialog box can be found by pressing Alt-F-A. And this functionality that we're looking for is in the Tools drop-down, Generals options. The first option that we have is a checkbox that says Always Create Backup. With this box checked, every time you save your workbook, Excel will create a backup copy in the form of an XLK file. Not a bad idea. The next option is for us to establish a password that somebody needs to have when they're going to open the workbook. So you can restrict access to your workbook in its entirety. You can also establish another password that serves as a filter to disallow people from modifying the workbook in its entirety. And finally, there's a read-only recommended checkbox that, when checked, will show a message to the user that suggests that spreadsheet should be opened in a read-only mode. But we're going to look at the passwords. I'm going to set up a password to open the workbook that's open, and I'm also going to set up a password to modify the workbook that's modify. Don't ever use these as passwords. And then I'm going to check the read-only recommended box, left-click OK. And now Excel asks me to re-enter the password. It doesn't say which password it wants me to re-enter, but it's actually the first one. It's the open password, the one we set up to allow users to even access the workbook in its entirety. Left-clicking OK, and now it asks me to re-enter the password that we set up to modify the workbook, which is modify, probably the stupidest password we could possibly pick, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to save the workbook. I'm going to replace it. So I'm going to now open up the workbook that we just set up the passwords for by going to Alt-F-R, Recent, left-clicking Chapter 51, and I first get a request to input the password to open up the workbook. That's not completely clear here with a dialog box, but that's what it is. Open is the password. Left-click OK. And then I get the password request to modify the workbook, which is worded as for write access, or I can open it up as read-only. So I'm going to left-click read-only. And I didn't get the message telling me that it suggests that I open up the workbook in read-only mode, because I actually did open up the workbook in read-only mode. The downside to this is the protection you've just established is available to anybody by going to Alt-F-A, Save As, going back to the Tools, the General Options, and even though I didn't have the password to modify this workbook, I can get rid of the password to open it up and clear whatever checkboxes I want to clear. Left-click OK and save it, and I've just stripped out the protections from this workbook. And I guess that's necessary because logically, if you prevented somebody from being able to change the password to open up the workbook, then the person that set up the password in the first place would never be able to access that and change the password or get rid of the password. So once you allow people to gain access to the workbook and to modify the workbook, there's a more refined level of protection that you can establish for your workbook. And again, you can set up a password. It's found on the Review tab in the Changes group, Protect Workbook. The default is to protect the workbook structure, which involves preventing the user from inserting or deleting, renaming, moving, hiding, unhiding any of the worksheets or the worksheet elements. And protecting the windows prevents the user from resizing the worksheet windows. And there's an option to set up a password to protect these two different aspects of the workbook. I'm going to cancel out of that. The next level of protection is the cells. And you may have noticed that in the changes group, there's an option to protect the sheet. And I've sort of bypassed the sheet and went right to the cells. Well, that's because those two things work hand in hand. When you're establishing protection for your cells, and I'm going to select a range and right-click and then left-click Format Cells, and on the Protection tab, the default is to have all of the cells locked. So if the cells are locked, I'm going to cancel that, then why is it that I can select the cells and input content into the cells? That's because in order to activate the cell protection, you have to protect the worksheet. So I'm going to go up here and left-click Protect Sheet, and I'm not going to set up a password. And below the password field, there's a lot of checkboxes that allows us to select what we want the users to gain access to. If the box is checked, the user will be able to gain access to, in this case, the selected locked cells and the selected unlocked cells. And that's the default setting. So it really depends upon whether you want your users to gain access to cells that are locked and unlocked. And even though users can gain access to the locked cells, that doesn't mean they can change the content or alter the locked cells. They'll just be able to select them. So I'm going to clear the checkbox for locked cells and left-click OK. And now I can't select anything because, like I said, by default, all the cells are locked. And I'm left-clicking all over the place. I'm not able to gain access to any of the cells. I'm going to unprotect the sheet and then select a range of cells, right-click, go back to the Format Cells, Protection, and unlock those cells. Left-click OK. And now when I protect the sheet, and in the Allow Users of this worksheet to choices, I have Select Unlocked Cells. Well, I just unlocked a range of cells. That's exactly what I want. I'm going to left-click OK, and now I can select that range, but I cannot select anything outside that range. So I have access to those unlocked cells. So the cell protection works hand in hand with the worksheet protection. The cell protection settings are ineffective unless you protect the worksheet. And the default setting for the cells is to be locked. And there are a lot of checkboxes that give you more refined control as to what you allow the users to do in a given range of cells that are protected. I'm going to cancel out of that. And you may have noticed another option. I'm going to right-click this range again, go back to Format Cells, where right under Locked, it says Hidden. I'm going to check the Hidden box, left-click OK, and I'm going to put a formula into one of these cells. It's a simple formula. Right now I can see that formula in the formula bar, but when I go back and protect the sheet, left-click OK, the formula disappears. So you can hide your formulas from your users. So there's one more level of protection that you can afford yourself when you're trying to protect your work and your workbook, your worksheets, your formulas. And that is to protect certain ranges. And what this allows really is that you can identify certain ranges that you allow people to gain access to. And that's found in the Changes command group on the Review tab. Allow users to edit ranges. And there is a lot of functionality associated with this protection mechanism. And just like in cells, this protection is activated when you protect the worksheet. But you can establish ranges and define passwords for those ranges that users that you define and set up have to utilize to access those ranges. And to learn more about how to set this all up, left-click Learn About Access Control and Permissions. So that's protecting the workbook and the worksheet. We began by looking at the options in the Save As dialog box where we could prevent access to the workbook or prevent somebody from modifying the workbook. We could have Excel automatically create a backup copy of our workbook when we save our workbook, and or we can have Excel present a message that suggests a user open up the workbook in read-only mode. We can refine the level of protection that we have for our workbook by protecting the structure of the workbook and or protecting the windows. There is yet an even lower level of protection afforded to you by Excel providing you the ability to protect your cells, where you can allow users to do certain things and disallow users to do certain things. You can also hide your formulas. Once you set these settings up at the cell level, you have to protect the worksheet in order for these settings to be active. And lastly, we looked at protecting ranges, where you can establish and set up users and user groups that enables them access to certain ranges.